Is it week 9 or is it week 10? I don't know. It's a blur. All I know is it's Thursday. It's Thursday. It's 11 o'clock. So here I am again, boring the hell out of you. It's been a bit of a struggle between Amy and myself to work out what to discuss this week, but we've got some ideas. Should this drag on for future weeks, but we won't spoil that now. Again, I hope everybody is as well as they can be, and that they haven't suffered too much sadness. We've just lost a friend's wife, again, but that was related to pancreatic cancer. And if you think things are bad, as I've just explained to Amy, they were expecting to go to the wedding of they've got 2 sons. Their son who lives in Portugal. They had to cancel the wedding, postpone it by a year because of COVID-19. And of course, sadly, the mother goes and passes away last week, so we'll not see either of her sons getting married. So it's a dreadful time, and it's a dreadful thing to happen to anybody. But I'm afraid to say life does tend to go on. What's happened in the past week? As you well know, I'm still writing my book on the combat of the Dornier 17, this twin-engine, twin-tailed aircraft, which was seen over the UK, or probably shot down quite often over the United Kingdom quite regularly. Just been looking very closely now at the operations where they strap these bombs underneath them and drop them on warships. Talk about hit or miss, but one of them, which was launched and sort of went in vertically, had the ability of going straight through a warship and out the other side. But really, it was another case with the Germans of too little, too late. 1944, their last time they actually used it. They tried to bomb the warship King George V in Plymouth Dock. And of course, having one of these radio-controlled bombs, you need to have a line of sight. So A, dropping a bomb at night. B, when there's mist. C, when the Royal Navy has put a smoke screen out. And D, this is the first time that they'd flown an operational mission in 7 months. You can understand that they didn't get their bombs anywhere near the target. The squadron commander and one of the most experienced pilots gets lost purely and simply because they were circling around Plymouth trying to find the target, couldn't see it, where they were then illuminated by searchlights and dazzled so much by the searchlights that the pilots of both aircraft lost control. One crashed in the sea south of Plymouth, taking the German squadron commander with it, and the other one crashed near Totnes in Devon, with 3 of the crew managing to bail out. So again, a bit of a disaster story, and of course, the next time they go into action is over the Normandy beaches, and it's not surprising that within the space of about a month, when you're trying to operate this type of aircraft, launching those bombs against ships in daylight, when the Allies then had air superiority, air supremacy. You can understand that by August 1944, bearing in mind we invaded in June 1944, the unit was disbanded, purely and simply because every time they went up, they just didn't stand a chance. That's one thing I've been working on. I've also been asked by a national magazine to write about German air-sea rescue in the war. They thought it was a very, very simple task, but it wasn't, because unlike the Royal Air Force, the Luftwaffe had a very, very established and very, very capable air-sea rescue organization from before the war. And as a result, they were quite successful in recovering their aircrew and our aircrew during the Battle of Britain. And as the war developed, they had quite efficient organizations, both in Germany, both in Holland, both in Western France, in the Black Sea, and in the Mediterranean. It will be an interesting story to discuss, because the Germans didn't like it because we kept on shooting them down, despite being painted white with having red crosses. If they're going to stray close to Royal Naval convoys, the RAF said, well, in that case, if you're reporting it back, we'll shoot you down. So the Germans objected to this and eventually gave up, and then started camouflaging their aircraft and escorting them. So there were, during the Battle of Britain, some quite monumental battles between the RAF and these very, very old, slow, twin-engined float planes, which were out there trying to pick up their aircrew. So what am I going to talk to you about today? Well, again, funny old thing, it's that time of the year again as we approach the Battle of Britain, just to talk about what was my first book. And here it is. It was written 26 years ago, and it's called Brothers in Arms. And if you look very carefully on the back wall, you can actually see, just out of view, the painting which was done by the renowned aviation artist Mark Postlethwaite to go on the cover of the book. He did that 26 years ago, and as a thank you gave me the painting. So as he keeps on saying, it won't be worth any money until he slips off the mortal coil. So every time I speak to him, I keep on asking if he's still alive, if I can flog it off at 3 times the price. Now, Brothers in Arms may, for some of the air crew who are listening today, may be something that doesn't go down too well. The reason why I called it Brothers in Arms is the book is about a German fighter squadron and a British fighter squadron in the Battle of Britain in between the months of August and October, November 1940. Why August? Because that's when the German fighter squadron arrived on the Channel coast. Why Brothers in Arms? As I sort of wrote the book, and 26 years ago, you can understand there were a lot of survivors on both sides still around. It came very, very obvious to me that despite a different language, despite the markings on the aircraft, and despite one of them was supporting the Nazi party, there was very, very little to differentiate between the two bunches of fighter pilots. They would do exactly the same thing. They would go off and do their missions. They would fight for their lives. They would shoot down their enemy. They would then return back to their bases. For the French, it would be Rennes or the Pas-de-Calais as the Battle of Britain went on. For 609 Squadron, the RAF Squadron, it would be RAF Middle Wallop, which is now the Fleet Air Base, the Army Air Corps base, not too far from Andover. And they do exactly the same thing. They go off partying. The Germans would go off and drink beer and wine, whilst the RAF pilots would drink beer and pins. So there was a degree of brotherly similarities between the two, but notwithstanding, one was trying to invade and one was trying to defend. So who were these units and what do they do? 609 Squadron first. 609 Squadron still exists. It is an auxiliary squadron based up at RAF Leeming. It was, before the war, it was an auxiliary squadron as well. For those who don't know, the 600 series of RAF squadrons, so 601, 602, 600, they were all named after counties. 609 was West Riding Squadron. Every squadron was associated with a county, and they were sort of weekend warriors. 609 Squadron had in its ranks, it had solicitors, it had journalists, it had people who worked for chemical companies. Some of the other auxiliary squadrons, which were closer to London, had slightly better off people. I think 601 Squadron was known as the Millionaire Squadron because there was a lot of quite well-off people who were there. And of course, these guys were training in peacetime. They were all officers. There was that when the war broke out, there was only one NCO pilot on 609 Squadron. They were all officers. And of course, when war broke out, 609 Squadron, everybody then became part of the regular Air Force. Training was accelerated, and 609 Squadron initially started off with Fairy Battles, which wasn't a very nice aircraft to fly. Those who know their history and the Battle of France will know. But then converted to the Spitfire, and they were based at Drem up in Scotland. For those who go up to Edinburgh regularly by train, you actually go past Drem, just south of Edinburgh. If I well remember, it's a very, very, last time I went past, it's no longer an airfield, but a very large chicken mansion, if you know what I mean. It chicken runs everywhere there. That's where they were based. And of course, their war, 609 Squadron's war, was very, very dull and boring. At that stage, the Luftwaffe would only just send aircraft across to attack shipping and target and harbours. They damaged a Heinkel 111 in February 1940. That was the first time they'd actually sort of had any success. They damaged one, and about a month or so later, they actually then shot down one. But that was it, really from September 1939 till May 1940. The squadron was just doing convoy patrols, going backwards and forwards, up and down to Lossiemouth and back to Drem, and just chasing off the occasional German aircraft that appeared. It would all change, of course, on the 10th of May 1940 when the Germans invaded France, Belgium, the Netherlands. It was the start of the Battle of France, and 609 Squadron was rushed down to RAF Northolt. For those again who've looked at the book, you can actually see where the dispersals used to be at RAF Northolt. I seem to remember now, the last time I was there, it's just the other side of the air traffic control tower, and I think part of it is now where there was a football pitch. And if they were thrown into the Battle of France quite quickly, because they actually went into action, I think, on the 31st of May 1940 over Dunkirk. There was a lot of aircraft to shoot at, but of course they had very, very little combat experience. And as a result, their losses were quite high, relatively. Inexperienced fighter pilots who were not professional pilots before the war. They were really thrown into it, and the first chap to die, actually coming back from Dunkirk, got lost in the smoke which was raised over Dunkirk, and ended up near Frinton-on-Sea, where his Spitfire ran out of fuel and it crashed and he was killed. Even though they went into action on the 31st of May 1940, the squadron received its first Distinguished Flying Cross on the 1st of June, when Flying Officer Ian Russell, who failed to return that day, he was awarded the DFC posthumously. The reason why is because on that first day and on the 1st of June 1940, he actually did quite well in accounting for at least 4 or 5 German aircraft. Difficult to say exactly how many he got, but again, he was a very, very brave man, and as a result, sadly, it was never ever seen again. Battle of Dunkirk was over. The squadron, still based at RAF Northolt, did some strange little bits and pieces. They escorted, if you've seen the film about Winston Churchill, The Darkest Hour, I think it's called, they were the squadron who escorted Winston Churchill across to France to conduct negotiations or discussions with the French, and they escorted him back. But from then on, it was very, very dull and boring for the squadron until at the start of July 1940, they moved to RAF Middle Wallop, and they remained going forward to RAF Warmwell, which is down near the coast in Dorset. And again, RAF Warmwell no longer exists. It's an open cast mine. They would forward base themselves there, and they would come back to Middle Wallop. They had a very, very very sudden, a very stark waking up there, because they lost 3 pilots straight off, including one of the fight commanders, because they were being bounced quite regularly by now quite experienced German fighter pilots. And to cut a long story short, the Battle of Britain really didn't start for them until the 11th of August 1940. And again, we see that's when the Battle of Britain really starts to take off, if you excuse the pun. They are responsible for guarding convoys. They are then responsible for intercepting German aircraft, bombing Portland, bombing Southampton, bombing Portsmouth, and they are really, really thrown into it. Their most successful day up until then is the 13th of August, where they claimed an astronomical amount of German aircraft that day. Overly inflated claims, one might say, but again, they did account for themselves quite well. And up until that stage, the casualties in the Battle of Britain proper had been very, very light. It was all going to change on the 14th of August 1940, when the Luftwaffe decided to attack Middle Wallop. There was a day of very, very bad weather, and what they did was send aircraft in to bomb airfields at low level. The German Junkers 88 unit managed to get over Middle Wallop, dropped its bombs on the hangar. The hangar is still there, still in use today. And 3 airmen were struggling to close the hangar doors to minimize the blast as the bomb came through the roof. The blast from the bomb sadly blew the door off its hinges, crushing 3 airmen and badly wounding another one. At the same time, a number of Spitfires were lost in the hangar, and also a number of Bristol Blenheims from the night fighter, the embryo night fighter squadron, 604 squadron, were lost. The squadron got its retribution. It shot down 2 of the Junkers 88s as they were streaking back in bad weather, and one of them, then they stumbled across a Heinkel 111, which was doing the same thing but in a different area, and that was being flown by the group commander of the unit, carrying a senior officer of a group captain rank from their headquarters and his navigation specialist. And to cut a long story short, they shot that aircraft down and it crashed into a naval depot just outside Romsey, killing all but 2 of the German crew. Big loss for the Germans that day, because the guys who were killed were quite experienced and highly decorated. The Battle of Britain, on that same day though, sadly, a Spitfire flown by Flying Officer Mac Goodwin, and he was known in the squadron, failed to return, and his Spitfire was seen chasing these aircraft back across the channel, and his Spitfire was last seen falling into the sea south of Bournemouth. Wind forward a bit, you come across to the 24th and 25th of August, which is the days that the German fighter squadron and the British fighter squadron first met each other in combat. A quieter day in the Battle of Britain, one might say the 24th of August. It was a bombing raid on Portsmouth, and the German squadron, who I'll come on to slightly later, came off better. They bounced 609 Squadron again. One of the German squadron commander managing to put a number of 20mm cannon shells up the backside of a Spitfire flown by an American pilot in the squadron, Andy Maindorf, who managed to get back. He managed to land back at Middle Wallop, but his Spitfire was so badly damaged by this cannon shell that the aircraft was written off. At the same time, the German squadron commander's wingman bounced another Spitfire squadron flown by 234 Squadron, shooting down a Polish pilot called Jan Zurakowski. Now, Zurakowski survived. He bailed out over the Isle of Wight. He later joined 609 Squadron, and after the war became a very, very successful test pilot. He was the pilot who invented what was known as the Zurakowski roll for the Gloucester Meteor, and he went to work for de Havilland in Canada and test flew a number of their aircraft there. So that was the first time that 609 Squadron and the German fighter squadron met each other in the Battle of Britain. And to put it bluntly, the 609 Squadron and those who were going to fly on 609 Squadron later came off worse, even though both RAF pilots survived. The following day was the 25th of August 1940, and the cover of the book actually sort of depicts that day there, because the aircraft at the bottom was actually shot down, not by 609 Squadron, but by 3 different pilots from 3 different squadrons, one of which was Roland Beaumont. Roland Beaumont later commanded 609 Squadron when they were flying Typhoons. And Roland Beaumont, again, for those I'm sure will know, he himself became a very successful test pilot after the war, the test pilot of the Lightning, and he was the test pilot of the beautiful but doomed TSR-2. I used to speak to him about the TSR-2, and he was very, very bitter about that. He said the aircraft was so far ahead of its time, and if people want to read an interesting story about an aircraft's career being blighted and brought to an untimely end by political interference, read the story of the TSR-2. The 25th of August, though, was a day where 609 Squadron accounted for itself quite well, and the German fighter squadron accounted for itself quite well, meeting themselves in combat but not shooting each other down. Again, this was another big attack on Portland, and the aircraft you see at the bottom there, which was the one, he was flown by a German pilot who was on his second mission. He was shot down by 1 Spitfire and 2 Hurricanes, crash landed just north of Portland, jumped out of his aircraft and thought, all right, I can't let this aircraft fall into enemy hands. So what he did was he soaked a handkerchief with petrol and set it on fire, not realizing he'd actually got petrol over his flying suit. And Roland Beaumont says he saw the aircraft crash land and he flew over the top of it and thought, shall I open fire? And he said, no, I won't. And as he looked back, he saw the Messerschmitt 109 burst into flames. He didn't see them, the German pilot rolling on the ground trying to put the flames out. So in his attempts to make sure that a Messerschmitt 109 didn't come into RAF hands, and barring by which time the RAF had a number of them, he gets through the combat without a scratch, then to set himself on fire. And he did survive the war, albeit badly burned. Now on, though, we start seeing the Battle of Britain swings towards London, and this is the last time that the 609 Squadron and the German fighter squadron meet for the time being. The German fighter squadron moves from its permanent base at Rennes in Brittany, and they go to the Pas de Calais, just down in the Étaples area, because of course then the Battle of Britain is swinging towards attacks on London. As a result, by moving to the Pas de Calais, they can get to London and back, because as we have learned in previous talks, the Messerschmitt 109 had a very, very limited duration because it didn't have that much fuel. 609 Squadron, though, remained at Middle Wallop, and it was thrown into the battle over London on the 7th of September. They'd been expecting to see the Germans coming over Hampshire and Sussex, but no, they were involved very, very big battles over London that day, and accounted for themselves quite well. Roll forward to the 15th of September. What we're seeing then is 609 Squadron flying right the way through the day, right the way through Battle of Britain Day, shooting down a number of German aircraft. They were one of the squadrons which was credited with the Dornier 17, which crashed on Victoria Railway Station. The successful pilot, a Canadian called Keith Ogilvie, getting a telegram from Queen Wilhelmina, the Queen of the Netherlands, excuse me, who was in London at the time and actually witnessed the combat and witnessed the aircraft crashed. She was not to know, even though she'd sent this telegram to 609 Squadron, that at least 6 other pilots from 6 other squadrons had claimed the same aircraft. The one, which again we have mentioned before, was the chap who collided with it, Ray Holmes of 504 Squadron. That day, though, sees 609 Squadron's second combat casualty. A guy called Geoffrey Galt. Again, he was under training at the start of the war, had a quiet war, and he was last seen spinning away out of combat. And they found a crash of a Spitfire the following day at Aviation in Kent, and they only identified his body because when they sadly pulled the body out of the wreckage, they found his name stitched on the collar of his #1 uniform, which he was flying at the time. That really sort of ends 609's part over London. They now go back to Middle Wallop because the Luftwaffe now are starting to probe other little bits and pieces. As we said, on the 15th of September, if we go back a couple of weeks, and I talked about it, not only were they bombing London, they were trying to draw the RAF away by bombing the Spitfire factories outside Southampton. So what you're finding then is 609 Squadron, for the latter part of the Battle of Britain, is involved in intercepting German aircraft, which are after the aircraft factory at Yeovil, with the Westland factory. They also go in broad daylight, these are attacks on Bristol Aircraft Factory in Bristol and the Gloucester Aircraft Factory. So 609 Squadron are ideally located, being either at Middle Wallop or down at Warnwell on the coast, to harry these aircraft all the way in and harry them all the way on the way back out again. And what we see is, again, they're quite successful. They do account for a number of German aircraft, but again, we see their next casualty, where a pilot from 609 Squadron collides with a German twin-engine fighter, to the horror of both the Germans and the surviving 609 pilots. They saw the 2 aircraft approaching, 2 aircraft then colliding into each other, and then both aircraft fluttering down. Amazingly, the German pilot managed to get out. Sadly, the 609 pilot was killed, and the gunner of the Messerschmitt 110 was killed. The Battle of Britain ended roughly about that. 609 Squadron on the 21st of October claimed its 100th kill of the Battle of Britain, a Junkers 88, which was carrying out a lone attack in the Lymington area. 2 pilots called Sidney Hill and Frank Howell sort of intercepted this aircraft, shooting it down near Lymington with the deaths of the crew. Post-war research, yeah, maybe they were a bit optimistic, claiming 100 successes by the 21st of October. But again, you know, they weren't to know. They were putting the claims in. They were being accepted with the claims. So now the Battle of Britain is over, and we're seeing the occasional attacks now by the Luftwaffe in the Southampton and Portsmouth area. And this all culminates on the 28th of November 1940. 609 Squadron a number of times had come up against the German fighter unit, not the one that's in the book, I hasten to add, which is the Richthofen-Geschwader, the Richthofen Squadron, who was commanded by a guy called Helmut Wick, W-I-C-K. He'd had a meteoric rise. He got the first victory for his unit as a pilot officer in September 1939. And by the end of October 1940, had been promoted to squadron leader, had over 50 victories to his name, had been awarded the Knight's Cross and the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. And he was now commanding the whole wing. You know, he literally, in the space of a month and a half, he'd gone from, to put it bluntly, shag pilot on the squadron to squadron commander, to wing commander, to group commander. Again, post-war research, maybe his meteoric rise was a bit, had been masterminded by the German propaganda. You know, you're finding days where he and his wing are claiming to have shot down 15 or 16 Spitfires and Hurricanes, when in fact we only lost 3, but he was credited with those. Rumour has it on the 28th of November, Wick was very, very keen to be the top scoring Luftwaffe ace. He had competition from a guy called Adolf Galland, he was based with his unit in the Pas-de-Calais, and the other ace, who was his instructor, was Wick's instructor, who was Werner Mulders. Mulders was slightly further down the pecking list, but Galland and Wick seemed to have a tit for tat. That afternoon, on the 28th of November 1940, Wick's unit had carried out an armed fighter sweep, sort of in support of a fighter bomber attack on Southampton, where he claimed a Spitfire. At the same time, Galland was doing exactly the same over Kent, and Galland had claimed, I think, two Hurricanes. So now the top scorer by 1 was Adolf Galland, and it is thought that Wick, who was, yeah, to put it bluntly, a bit of a very me, self, I, wanted to get another one to get him above Galland. They'd taken off that evening on a second fighter sweep, and his wingman, I got his diary after the war, was complaining all the way through. Wick used to fly full throttle the whole time, and used to leave his wingman behind and the rest of the formation behind. He was so keen to get into battle and to get an aircraft. And to cut a long story short, by himself, he bounced a Spitfire. That Spitfire was flown by Paul Ballion of 609 Squadron. He'd only been in the squadron about a month and a half, 2 months. It had been the second time that he'd been involved in an incident. The first time he'd had suffered an engine failure and had been forced to bail out over Uphaven, his Spitfire crashing on the airfield. And this time, sadly, he was shot down and killed. What Wick didn't notice then was that that Ballion had been flying as a wingman to a guy called John Dundas. Dundas was a typical fighter pilot, made up the rules as he went along, very, very popular, hard drinker, hard player, hard partier. He was, again, a rising star in the RAF. And typical fighter pilot, he was known as Scruffy because he was the most scruffiest flight lieutenant next to Gibbo Gibson, who's probably not listening in, but he was a very, very sort of, he was his own man. And what happened was, Wick's wingman saw the Spitfire slip behind the 109. He saw the Spitfire open fire, and he saw the 109 pilot bail out. Only one Messerschmitt 109 was lost that afternoon, and that in that location, and that was Helmut Wick's aircraft. Unfortunately, John Dundas didn't notice Wick's wingman coming up behind him, and he too was then shot down. He didn't bail out and is still reported as missing. Wick, even though they carried out massive an air-sea rescue search, they never ever found his body, even though he bailed out. And his score ended at 56. As again, post-war research would disagree that he had 56, but that's what he was officially credited with. So going back to Brothers in Arms, I'm not going to go on to the German side today because I think I would have talked a bit long enough, but I'll actually finish the book, and not a plug, but the book has been out 26 years. It's out of print now, but in the next month it's coming out again in paperback, and I've got to get that finished next week by putting an index in. So if anybody's interested in reading the full story, they can. It's going to be available for all good bookshops, but I would definitely recommend you get it through Amazon because you get it cheaper. What happened was on the 4th of May 1941, 609 Squadron and one of the pilots that had met them over Portsmouth and over Portland on the 25th of August 1940 met again. That day, Fighter Command was very much on the offensive, and we were seeing aircraft going across to France, but the Germans at the same time were coming back. They didn't realise, so it was the 4th of June 1940, not the 4th of May. What the Germans didn't realise is they would be shortly withdrawn from the Channel front, and they would be going off to Russia, to the Russian front to invade. And what was happening this day was a pilot from 54 Squadron had been shot down escorting Blenheims attacking a target in northern France, and he'd been seen to bail out, and 609 Squadron had gone out as one of the squadrons to try and find him in the sea. To cut a long story short, they were bounced by the group commander of the unit, and his wingman was a guy called Heinrich Rühl. Now Rühl had flown with the German unit right the way through the Battle of France, right the way through the Battle of Britain, had converted from the Messerschmitt 109E to the Messerschmitt 109F, and because he was an experienced NCO pilot, was flying with his as wingman to his group commander. What happened next is not known, but in the bounce, Rühl collided with the flight commander of A Flight 609 Squadron, a guy called John Kirchin. Both aircraft were there 1 minute, gone the next. Neither pilot survived. So that's how Brothers in Arms starts. It starts with the history of the 24th and 25th of August. It then covers the history of 609 Squadron, and then you can actually draw it alongside the history of the German Fighter Cross Squadron at the same time. And the two dates they meet first, and the one day they meet second, sort of actually spans the story of the book. Brothers in Arms, though, they were fighter pilots. They were doing a job. They enjoyed doing their job. As the Battle of Britain came on, you talked to the German pilots, and they had a disease called canal krankheit, and it was called channel sickness. They were so nervous about coming across here and seeing their friends being shot down in that. So what they would do, they would get the briefing, and from the squadron commander downwards, each would go to the latrine, and it was known as canal krankheit, channel sickness. They were so nervous to meet up with the RAF. So there you go, Brothers in Arms. That's the RAF side. I may consider talking about the German side at a different juncture. I've been talking for 35 minutes now, and I think my coffee, I've just got some coffee left. I hope that keeps you interested. Don't buy the book if you want to, because it's not out yet, but if you're interested, you'll be able to pick it up on Amazon very, very shortly. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it interesting, and I am open to questions from everybody, apart from Brian Fair, who always tries to catch me out.
Oh, I think the majority, we've had 4 questions through. 3 are from Brian. Would you like me to carry on?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so Brian's first question: which came first, the squadron motto "Tally Ho," or the adoption of the saying by RAF pilots when they were going into attack?
The Tally Ho actually goes to the West Riding Hunt. So Tally Ho, well, again, Tally Ho was whatever you used to say. They still do call that when the enemy is sighted and you go to engage. But Tally Ho is also, if you look at the squadron badge 609, it's 2 hunting horns, and that's where the actual connection comes from.
Thank you very much, Chris. Brian's next one is a comment. So he knew B. Beaumont from his test pilot days at BAE Wharton, and remembered him telling him that the 609 was the first squadron to reach 100 victories during Battle of Britain, although this was before his time as squadron CO. Yeah,
he was a very, very interesting man. He was demoted after the Battle of Britain for taking his fiancée for a spin in his Hurricane. Would never ever happen today. Never happen today. He was an incredibly gifted pilot. He flew with 87 Squadron. Then he became a test pilot for Hawkers. So he was the exponent of the Hawker Typhoon. He then ended up commanding a Hawker Tempest wing when he was shot down and taken prisoner. And after the war, he then decided he was such an accomplished pilot. He was He was the test pilot for the Canberra, test pilot for the Lightning, and test pilot for the TSR2, just to name a few.
We've had a comment from Terry in France. I thought the Spitfires were built in West Bromwich in the Midlands, but you mentioned Southampton. Were they also built there?
The Spitfire factory was at Woolston, and there was later in the war it was at Castle Bromwich. It was the Spitfire factory there. But the bombing of Woolston, because if you remember, the Spitfire was made by Supermarine. Supermarine used to make seaplanes, and it also made the S6 Schneider Trophy aircraft. And of course, Castle Bromwich is nowhere near the sea, and if you're going to make seaplanes, an ideal place to do it is at Woolston outside Southampton. However, it was an easy target for the Luftwaffe, which is why it was moved away.
Thank you very much. Brian also says at Radcliffe College, just down the A46 from Leicester, the school are building a Spitfire in memory of Paul Ballion, and incorporating bits of his crashed Spitfire in the build. He was a student there.
Yep. I seem to remember that as part of people who have suffered hardship on their operational tours, the Ministry of Defence have been going around various places and digging up aircraft. And one of the aircraft I believe they recovered was, there wasn't much left of it, because if people know Uphaven, it's a hard chalk area from what I remember. There wasn't much left of it. That was one of the projects that this Ministry of Defence team did, was to recover Paul's aircraft as a way of helping people get over PTSD and what they'd suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Thank you, Chris. Erica says, how about a future talk on the little-known RAF mutinies in 1946?
Mutinies?
Mutinies. Erica?
This is the story from, correct me if I'm wrong, is the people who, the war was over and they were still trapped out in the Far East. And as a result, people got very, very upset because, back in UK, the war was over. Again, I think we've seen this, the VE Day came on the 8th of May 1940, but of course VJ Day didn't come until much later in the year, and the war was still going on out there. And we even, there were bomber command crews were being assigned to what was known as Tiger Force to go out to take the war to the Japanese. And yes, there are books and there are stories about this going on. Whether I'm the best person to speak about that is another matter.
Thank you, Chris. Erica, if you've got any more suggestions like that, if you want to pop them over to opconnect@rafa.org.uk, so that's OPCONNECT @rafa.org.uk, then we can try and track down someone that can talk about that one as well. Bob says, another very interesting talk. Many thanks, Chris. Michael says, was the Spitfire also built in Swindon, now on the Honda site?
Yes, because again, I can remember when I was at Bryce Norton driving down, used to go past it, and I think it was called the Supermarine Sports and Social Club, and it was at Long Marston. Yes, they were, and there used to be a Spitfire there. So yes, the Spitfires, when they dispersed them, did move them out, and yes, it is now the Honda factory.
Thank you very much, Chris. There's no more questions. So if everyone's asked all their questions, I hope you've enjoyed the talk today. Brian says, great talk. Looking forward to next week. So Chris is going to get over next week's session to me shortly after this, and that will go out in the email.
It's back to writing about dropping bombs on warships now, I'm afraid.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining in, and we look forward to seeing you again next week, Chris. And there's more sessions. So tomorrow we're joined by ACM Sir Dick, who's going to be talking about his time in the RAF, and that's going to be a really great session. And then next week's sessions are going to go out in an email on Sunday as normal. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Chris. As always, you're fabulous, and enjoy your weekends, and I'll speak to you soon.